Chapter 17. The Empire's Failed Bet. Empires are usually undone by armies, revolutions, or economic collapse. The kinds of forces covered in earlier chapters of this book. Ceylon's coffee industry was undone by something almost embarrassingly small. A microscopic fungus invisible to the naked eye. It took less than 2 decades to destroy an industry the British Empire had spent generations and untold fortunes building. It's one of the strangest and most dramatic collapses in this entire book. And it happens to have produced, almost as an accidental byproduct, one of the most famous beverage brands in the world. Just not the one anyone actually intended. An island with old coffee roots. Ceylon's relationship with coffee predates British involvement by centuries. According to long-standing local legend, Arab traders may have experimented with coffee cultivation on the island well before the Portuguese seized control of it in 1505. What's better documented is the Dutch period that followed. The Dutch gained control of Ceylon in 1658. By 1690, they had introduced genuinely systematic coffee cultivation methods to the island. Early Dutch shipments of Ceylon coffee reaching Amsterdam in 1721 reportedly commanded a higher price than either Java or Mocha coffee. A remarkable early endorsement of the island's growing conditions. This came from a market that already had 2 of the most prestigious coffee names in the world to compare it against. It wasn't until the British occupied the island in 1795 and 1796 that coffee cultivation expanded into something approaching a serious colonial industry. Sir Edward Barnes established the first substantial British-owned upland coffee plantation in 1825. For the next several decades, coffee grew into one of Ceylon's genuinely leading exports. A bubble worth £5 million. British enthusiasm for Ceylon coffee eventually curdled into something closer to financial mania. Investors poured roughly £5 million into Ceylon coffee plantations during a speculative frenzy in the 1840s. The same kind of optimistic momentum drove it that has fueled agricultural investment bubbles and commodities all over the world, in nearly every era. In 1845, that bubble burst. Hundreds of investors were financially ruined in the collapse. A sharp, painful reminder that Ceylon coffee could destroy fortunes just as easily as it built them. This happened decades before the disease that would eventually finish the job even more thoroughly. Remarkably, the industry recovered from the 1845 crash and kept growing. Exports climbed steadily through the following decades. They reached £12,400,000 by 1836 and continued upward from there. They eventually peaked at a genuinely extraordinary £118,160,000 in 1870. That figure placed Ceylon among the significant coffee exporting territories anywhere in the British Empire. Total coffee acreage on the island reached as high as 340,000 acres at its absolute peak. By every reasonable measure available at the time, Ceylon's coffee industry looked like an unqualified colonial success story. The fungus that arrived right on schedule. And then, with almost unbearably cruel timing, disaster struck at nearly the exact moment the industry reached its high-water mark. In 1869, a fungal disease called Hemilia vestatrix appeared on the island's coffee plantations for the first time. It's closely related to ordinary wheat rust. People came to know it simply as the Ceylon leaf disease. Within 10 to 15 years, it had practically ruined the entire industry. The numbers involved in that collapse are genuinely staggering to look at side by side. Ceylon's coffee exports had reached £118,160,000 in 1870. They crashed all the way down to a mere £1,147,000 by 1900, a decline of well over 99% in the space of 30 years. Coffee acreage collapsed just as dramatically. From that peak of 340,000 acres down to only 4,875 acres by 1903, then 2,433 acres by 1907, then 1,389 acres by 1912, and finally just 941.5 acres by 1919. In 1917, total coffee production on the entire island amounted to a mere 2,200 pounds. A rounding error compared to the industry's former scale. This happened on an island that, within living memory of many of its own residents, had once been shipping well over 100 million pounds of coffee a year to markets around the world. Ceylon, once a substantial coffee exporter, had by this point actually become a net coffee importer. It could no longer even supply its own domestic demand. One account summarized the entire arc of the story in a single memorably blunt sentence. Ceylon's day in coffee was a cycle of 50-odd years. 50 years to build an empire-scale agricultural industry from nothing. Fewer than 20 to watch it almost completely disappear. From ruined coffee fields to Ceylon tea. Here's where this story takes its strangest and most consequential turn. Coffee plantations across Ceylon collapsed under the relentless spread of the leaf disease. Planters didn't simply abandon their ruined land. They replanted it on a massive scale with an entirely different crop, tea. Land that had once been dense with dying, disease-ravaged coffee trees was steadily turned over to tea cultivation instead. By 1917, only 810 acres remained planted in coffee across the entire island. That pivot turned out to be one of history's more consequential accidents of agricultural necessity. The tea industry that grew up on the wreckage of Ceylon's collapsed coffee plantations went on to become one of the most famous and successful tea brands in the entire world. Ceylon tea, a name now recognized globally, grew on the very same hillsides. Many of the very same planting families grew it, the ones who had spent the better part of a century building a coffee industry the fungus ultimately destroyed. The British Empire's failed bet on Ceylon coffee accidentally produced one of its most enduring colonial agricultural successes. Just in a completely different product than anyone had originally intended to build an empire around. India, the same disease, a very different outcome. Coffee cultivation across the water in British India followed a strikingly different trajectory. It faced many of the very same challenges Ceylon did, including, eventually, the same leaf disease. Systematic coffee cultivation in India began in 1840. It built on the foundation laid centuries earlier by Baba Budan's original smuggled seeds, which we covered several chapters back. Those seeds were still growing in the hills of Mysore generations after his death. Indian coffee exports grew steadily through the mid-1800s. They reached 11,690,000 pounds by 1859. They doubled again to 26,745,000 pounds by 1864. India's coffee industry continued growing from there. It eventually peaked at 56,817,000 pounds of exports in 1872. That figure was roughly half of Ceylon's own peak. But it was still a genuinely substantial industry by any measure. And crucially, unlike Ceylon, India's coffee industry never collapsed anywhere near as completely. Production and acreage did decline in the decades that followed. They settled into a range of roughly 20 to 60 million pounds of exports annually. Cultivated acreage generally held between 200,000 and 300,000 acres for more than 50 years. Even as late as 1920, India was still exporting a genuinely meaningful 30,526,832 pounds of coffee. A fraction of its historic peak, certainly. But nothing remotely close to Ceylon's near-total wipeout. Why did the same basic threat produce such wildly different outcomes in two neighboring British colonial territories? The sources behind this book don't offer a single, tidy explanation. But the broader pattern is telling. Different growing regions. Different altitudes. Different degrees of exposure and vulnerability to the fungus. Different levels of investment in disease management. All of these likely played some role. What's clear is that India's coffee industry, while genuinely wounded by the same disease that devastated Ceylon, managed to survive as a real, functioning export industry. Ceylon's essentially didn't survive at all. A third response: Java adapts instead of collapsing or surviving. Ceylon collapsed almost entirely. India wounded but survived largely intact. The Dutch East Indies, revisited from our earlier chapter on Java, chose a third path entirely: adaptation. The same leaf disease that devastated Ceylon and challenged India eventually swept through Java's lower altitude plantations as well. It effectively drove the original Arabica variety out of every district below roughly 3,500 feet. Rather than watching those lower altitude estates collapse the way Ceylon's had, Dutch planters and colonial agricultural authorities responded differently. They systematically replaced Arabica in the vulnerable lowlands with hardier, more disease-resistant varieties. Robusta and Liberica coffee, along with various hybrids bred specifically from them. By 1919, the Netherlands East Indies government's own official survey of cultivated coffee acreage across its territories reflected just how thoroughly this substitution had taken hold. Robusta occupied a substantial share of the total growing area that Arabica had once claimed almost entirely on its own. Line these three outcomes up side by side, and the contrast becomes genuinely instructive. Ceylon got hit hard and fast at the height of a speculative single-variety boom. It essentially had no fallback plan and paid for it with near-total collapse. India grew across a wider range of conditions and terrain. It absorbed the damage without ever losing its identity as a real coffee-exporting nation. Java had a colonial administration with the resources and agricultural expertise to actively breed and plant an entirely different, hardier species at scale. It managed to treat the exact same biological threat as a problem to engineer around, rather than a catastrophe to simply endure. 3 colonial coffee industries. 1 common enemy. 3 genuinely different endings. Trying to rebuild from almost nothing. Ceylon didn't give up on coffee entirely, even after the disease had done its worst. Agricultural researchers continue to believe the island's climate and soil remain genuinely well suited to coffee cultivation in principle. Experimental stations at Peradeniya and Anuradhapura spent years in the early 20th century testing disease-resistant varieties. Robusta, Canephora, an Ugandan variety, and various Robusta hybrids. They specifically hoped to find a strain hardy enough to survive where the original Arabica trees had been wiped out so completely. By the time the sources behind this book were written, those efforts had yet to restore anything resembling Ceylon's former coffee industry. But the hope for eventual revival, grounded in the island's genuinely favorable growing conditions, had not entirely disappeared either. A lesson in fragility. There's a sobering lesson buried in this chapter that's worth sitting with for a moment. Every threat to coffee covered earlier in this book involved human decisions, human institutions, and, at least in principle, human choices that could have gone differently. Religious persecution. Royal monopolies. Revolution. Slavery's brutal economics. Market speculation. Corporate warfare. Ceylon's coffee industry wasn't destroyed by any of that. It was destroyed by a fungus. A life form far too small to see. It didn't care about British colonial ambition, £5 million investment bubbles, or 50 years of accumulated agricultural expertise. It simply spread, plant to plant, leaf to leaf, until an entire island signature export had been reduced from over £100 million a year to a couple thousand. It's a genuinely humbling reminder. Even an empire capable of conquering, colonizing, and reshaping distant lands by force could still be brought to its knees, agriculturally speaking, by something with no army, no ideology, and no awareness whatsoever that it was doing anything at all. What's coming next? We've now spent several chapters following coffee through cultivation, chemistry, commerce, and catastrophe. It's time to turn back to the machines themselves. The devices people actually built, refined, and reinvented across 2 centuries to turn a roasted bean into a finished cup. From crude iron pans all the way to the pressurized, precision-engineered brewing equipment that modern coffee culture eventually came to depend on. In the next chapter, we trace the invention of the modern coffee machine.